Good evening. My name is Angie Brenner. I'm the city librarian for Mill Valley and pleased to welcome you to First Friday. Before we start, I'd like to thank the Mill Valley Library Foundation and the Friends for their ongoing and generous support of First Fridays and many other programs at the library. After tonight's presentation, there will be a Q&A followed by a book signing in the lobby. In his book of biographical essays, Cultural Amnesia, the critic Clive James suggests in passing that if Homer had been beamed to the future and given a Braille edition of Pride and Prejudice, he wouldn't have made much sense of the petticoats, the dance cards, or the Regency tea sets. But he would have grasped instantly that Austen's novel was, like his own epics, a gripping and often amusing story of human vanity, longing, family tensions, and sublime emotional resolution where none seems possible. The obvious point James makes is that stories are essentially universal. They haven't changed much in thousands of years and probably never will as long as humans are telling them. His more subtle point is that whatever else these stories may be, these so-called classics, edifying, morally uplifting, historically informative, and so on, they are also really fun to read. If we pick them up without being aware of the burden of their lofty credentials, we really can't put them down. But of course, that burden is hard to ignore. Books that hang around for a long time do get discussed, argued over, theorized about, and inevitably larded with interpretation. Tonight's speaker, Kevin Smokler, author of Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School, has come to the rescue, reminding us that great literature speaks for itself, great stories tell themselves. So what if these works were reduced to dreary labor in our teens? We're grown-ups now. We can do what we want. We can just read them. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Smokler.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thanks so much for coming. This is amazing. Thank you all for having me. And thank you to Angie and everybody at the Mill Valley Public Library for being here. Thank you to my friend Julie Flynn Seiler, who kind of made this happen with an introduction. And thank you all for being here this evening. I cannot get over what a place this is. I mean, you sit here and I love this library as a book person would for all of the obvious reasons. But more than that, I especially love that this library has a kind of deeply imagined beauty that does two seemingly contradictory things at the exact same time. On the one hand, it makes the things we love, it exalts things we love. It exalts things we hold dear. Books, reading, learning, the pursuit of knowledge and enlightenment. We are not only in a temple for such things, we're in kind of a spa. Right? where we can be both holy and indulged at the same time, if you would. But the thing is, in the act of exaltation, we often beat the joy out of it. It is very easy to exalt things, but to have them intimidate us at the same time. They can zap us of the joy by seeming to demand our respect. So it is to me the highest compliment that this place not only exalts things we love, but it makes them approachable and welcoming at the same time. It is in fact the highest degree of praise in my little Midwestern come Californian frame of reference to be inviting and yet wondrously so. And I think we're in exactly that kind of place this evening, and this is how I feel when I'm here. This spring, as was mentioned, I published a book called Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School, in which I did just that. I went back to 50 books that were assigned to me as a high school student in the late 1980s, and I'm proud to say that a few of those 50s were read right here and researched and written upon right here at the Mill Valley Public Library. I can show you the table if anybody cares, but probably not. It is downstairs in the fiction room in the back corner, and it has an outlet underneath it. So I could plug my laptop in, which I figured I'd be distracted sitting next to the door, and I wanted to not have to run outside to recharge my laptop batteries. So that's where I put myself. And I found that during the 10 months that I spent writing this book, when I was scared about meeting a deadline, when I was stuck, when I was feeling wholly inadequate, not as a writer, but as a person, and anyone who's ever written anything knows that those two things go together when you feel inadequate, I would come here. And I would be in a lousy frame of mind, and this place would make me feel normal. I could tell this place was special, but it gave me the feeling that this is how I would like my life as a writer and a reader to be. Serene and wise and fortunate. Can a place, an experience, a book, be these two seemingly contradictory things? Can it be unique, yet ubiquitous? Can it be awe-inspiring, yet inviting? This is the left-hand, right-hand dichotomy of this thing we so ponderously call classic works of literature that I would like to speak to you about this evening. I'll begin by sharing just a little bit about my book, but I would like the bulk of our conversation to be about the larger issues that this thing called classic raises. These things called classic raise. What is a classic? How do books become classics? How do they stay that way or lose that title? Because by golly, they do lose that title. What can a classic do, and what can it unfortunately not do? And finally, how can great books help us to lead great lives? So that'll be our agenda for this evening, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And if we are interested, right before Q&A, as a room, we can play a few rounds of Name That Classic trivia. Does that sound okay? Okay, and maybe we'll do like 3 correct answers, and each person who answers correctly gets a free copy of the book. Does that sound okay? Okay, so that will be the agenda. Let's start at the beginning. The book itself. Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School is a collection of 50 essays. Each one is on a classic work of literature that you probably encountered in a high school English class. If you didn't first encounter that, you will be familiar with the name and you will know that someone somewhere along the way has referred to this book as a classic. Each essay asks the question, what relevance does this book have to an ordinary person? An ordinary person leading a busy life with the commitments of career and family and children and community involvement and friends. What does a classic work of role can a classic work of literature play in this person's life? Put simpler, the idea for Practical Classics was, could I make an argument for the rereading of great books that spoke not just to why, but how? The awe-inspiringness of great books, the why, if you will, I think we all understand. Great books are great. I certainly didn't need to spend 10 months to come here and tell you that. But let's talk about the how. The how is the inviting part. Can great books be instrumental in everyday lives? Can classics be practical? So, how did I choose the list of 50? That is always the first question I get. It was a multi-step process, which I'll outline very quickly. Number one, I called all of my English teachers from high school. And I said, some version of, remember me, I'm doing this thing, and what do you remember assigning me? Some of them remembered, some of them did not, and said quite reasonably that was a long time ago. And a few of them were like, who? As best I could, I assembled what I could get from them, and that was kind of the bulk of the list that made up the essays in this book. Next, as best I could, I made some reasonable inquiries into what English teachers were assigning now, what they had assigned in the past, and what I sort of reasonably understood as a classic, even if I didn't personally read it as a high school student. Third, I tried as best I could not to make this a list of books by dead white guys, because this is 2013 and not 1913. Fourth, I had only 10 months to write this book, which meant, and I am a very, very slow reader, which meant that anything that was super long or super complicated, unfortunately, had to go. I would have loved to have read Middlemarch. Have you seen Middlemarch? You can commit a mugging with Middlemarch. I would have loved to included Chekhov or some Russian novelists. There's a lot of complicated names in Chekhov. There's a lot of multi-syllable trying to keep everything straight, and that would have taken all 10 months for me. So unfortunately, I couldn't do those. And finally, it was very important to me that this list of classics that I was going to recommend you make room for in a busy life not be a pet rock. That it not be some frozen in time cultural artifact of when I graduated from high school in the year 1991. I guess that actually would not have made it a pet rock. That would have made it maybe a Norman Schwarzkopf action figure or something like that. So, I tried, therefore, to include classics that were more prevalent in my parents' generation, as well as those that a person who had graduated from high school, say within the last 5 years, would have come in contact with. In other words, the generation before me and the generation after. So from all of this mishigas emerged a list of what we have here. 50 books I hope are worthy of another look that you may have first encountered as a teenager, or maybe even a first look if you have not read them at all. My favorite compliments for this book so far have been, now I have a whole new reading list that I didn't need. Thanks a lot, bucko. Or, I read this book every morning in the bathroom. It sits right next to the toilet brush. You laugh, but that is high praise. I read some of the best things that I read in the bathroom. And more importantly, would you want any reading material that annoyed, upset, bored, or disgusted you in the bathroom? I would not. My favorite criticism has been, this book contains too many spoilers. You, in fact, reveal what happens in every one of the classics you talk about. I don't know what to say about that. If whoever is reading this book does not want me spoiling the fact that Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet end up together at the end of Pride and Prejudice, a book that has been out for 200 years now, allow me to suggest that that person purchase stock in time machines as soon as they become available and rectify this injustice immediately. Otherwise, I feel no guilt about spoiling a book that has been around for 2 centuries. So Practical Classics came out in mid-February, and you may have read about it in the Chronicle. You may have heard me on Michael Krasny. You may have not. This may have been the first we've come in contact with each other. I have been all over the country with this book, and this evening here at the Mill Valley marks the beginning of my fall tour. I'm doing a number of engagements at libraries and at universities and at book festivals this fall. I have been enormously lucky. Unfortunately, here in 2013, in the current publishing climate, this sort of thing does not happen to too many authors whose last names aren't Rowling, King, Tan, or Chabon. I have been enormously lucky, and I have had a great time. thus far. More importantly, though, I have spent some of the richest hours of my professional life as a writer discussing literature's big questions with communities all over this nation, just like yours. Allow me to share a few of those questions, which will comprise the bulk of our conversation this evening. Question 1, what makes a book a classic? Every time I hear that, I want to say, and why don't we just talk about the meaning of life and where people come from, and we'll wrap it up in 10 minutes and call it an evening. But thankfully, there are some well-known opinions on this very subject. The one that you may have heard about in high school and that was bandied about quite a bit in mid-century America was the great book's opinion of a classic. Meaning a book is a classic because throughout the ages, some cabal of credentialed people have deemed it as such. This interpretation, by the way, is beloved by people who consider themselves a cabal of credentialed people, and it usually reflects the point of view of people who think they're part of that group also. And thus, university professors and book reviewers over the age of 97 like this point of view very much. This was the metric that was used to judge classics in the 1950s and 60s, and if at home growing up you had a shelf of great books right next to the World Book encyclopedias in your living room, that's how they got there. Of course, at that time, it was impossible for a great book in the minds of these credentialed people to be written by anyone who was not male, white, European, or 2 centuries dead, which is why the great books seem sadly myopic today. That definition of the great books. Definition number 2 of classics is the kind of Harold Bloom definition, which is named after the great Yale scholar of literature. And that definition says that a great book is the inevitable byproduct of literary genius. And since there exists many a great roll call of literary geniuses, well, just do simple matchmaking, find the genius, and you found the classic. That whole interpretation seems a bit nice and neat for me. It does not take into account that many geniuses are simply unrecognized in their lifetime. Many classics gain and lose stature throughout their life and throughout the ages, like Michelin star restaurants. And that some books, which were considered throwaway pulp fiction in their day, became classics many hundreds of years later. This argument essentially removes any context of any kind from consideration. And we'll get to what those different contexts are in a moment, but first, we will throw in my definition of a classic. Kevin's definition of a classic is an old friend. Meaning that a classic is not just a book that gives us comfort, but a book that gives us challenge. It is a book that when we pick it up, we are instantly living all of the other lives we have lived since we last read that book. And at the same time, we noticed how much we have changed since that last visit, and we also feel like not a moment has passed, just as we do when we visit with an old friend. That visit, because the book itself has not changed a bit, that visit invites us to consider our own passage, our own progress. That visit encourages us to live not only different, but ideally better. A classic is therefore extraordinary, yet welcoming too. It was the great author Italiano Calvino who said that a classic is a book that never runs out of things to say, which is a lot simpler and better put than I did. I would also like to add, though, that a classic is a book that never actually changes, but continually reminds us of how much we have changed and how much this world has changed. Now, my definition here means there are many ways for a book to become a classic. It can be judged on the basis of aesthetic merit, on the basis of relevance, endurance through time, just to name 3. My definition, though, also has a number of flaws, and I happen to like the flaws just as much as the assets. Number 1, I've mentioned a few of these. 1, we often fail to recognize classics the first or even the 10th time around. The creator may be long dead by then, which unfortunately is sad and an injustice. Not an on-purpose injustice, not anyone's fault, it just is very sad. And this is, of course, what happened to Jane Austen. Jane Austen was not recognized in her lifetime, but was in fact recognized many, many years later after she was gone, and her nephew, who admired her a great deal, wrote a memoir about being Jane Austen's nephew. This is also what happened to The Great Gatsby, which was not recognized in F. Scott Fitzgerald's lifetime, and he died at age 42 thinking he a failure. This is also what happened to most of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Flaw number 2. Classic books are just as subject to the winds of fashion and trendiness as clothes or music or cuisine. We like to think of them as more stalwart and eternal than that and impervious to such frivolities. They are not, unfortunately. Thanks to our own myopia and bigotry, we are shamefully slow in acknowledging the classicness of books by women authors, of books by non-Caucasian authors, of authors from working class instead of privileged backgrounds, and authors not from Europe or America or even the American Midwest or Northeast. As anybody who has spent some time in California knows, there is a virtual roll call of authors who were disadvantaged to be born here out west, and hence their literary greatness was not acknowledged until way after it should have been. Sadly, this kind of willful blindness also works in the opposite direction. My mother's favorite book in high school was A Separate Peace by John Knowles. When I got to high school, at a liberal progressive high school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, also a liberal progressive college town. Am I losing my mic here? No? Okay, good. I did not read A Separate Peace. In fact, I didn't even know what A Separate Peace was until I started doing this book. And why? Because, although no one has ever said it out loud, the message that I received in high school English is here in Ann Arbor in the mid-1980s, in a liberal progressive Midwestern college town, we are simply not interested in literature being written about a bunch of privileged white kids at a Northeastern prep school. That is not the sort of thing we do in high school English here. Separate Peace suffered the same fate at my high school, one example, for entirely different reason. Flaw number 3. Since classic, the word classic, is always to some degree about durability through time, it is far too often a popularity contest or a beauty pageant rather than a measure of artistic merit. How many of you know the song YMCA? Is YMCA a classic? Yes? Anyone disagree with that? YMCA will be around a very long time. It will be around a whole lot longer than many great pieces of music by Miles Davis or Sonic Youth or Charlie Parker or artists that are infinitely more credentialed and critically revered than the Village People. Why? Because we do not put on Kind of Blue at weddings and bar mitzvahs and high school graduations and retirement parties and every occasion where people get together to celebrate. 50-50 chance you're going to hear YMCA. The argument there is that YMCA, by sheer brute force of refusing to be ignored, has become a classic. We can argue whether it deserves it or not. Now, one of the saving graces of this durability through time, popularity versus aesthetic merit problem is our friend the internet. As it relates to this thing, durability through time, nothing is ever lost anymore. We cannot equate classicness with rarity or scarcity the way we used to be able to. Everything can be found. Everything can find its audience, can have its fans coalesce around it. Nothing is gone. So it means there is no longer an agreed upon list of what is great. And we can say that there is some sadness to that because it makes things a whole lot more complicated. On the other hand, the onus comes from the heavens, where classics used to emanate from, to us. Now, every one of us has got to armor up improve and refine our critical skills, and be able to express with some degree of eloquence why we like what we like. The onus of what is great has gone from being told to us to coming from us. Now, this of course raises another complication and flaw with my definition. Flaw number 4 is subjectivity. Your classic may not be my classic. Again, this moves the authority from on high down here with the rest of us, with all of us. Onus is now on each of us to state why we like what we like. And this is a skill that is absolutely crucial to life here in the 21st century. I do not want to send a kid currently in school out into the world who is not able to express eloquently why he or she feels the way they feel about the things, about the art and culture they consume. We do not teach this nearly in schools enough, and we must. If anything will resign art and culture to the sidelines in the decades to come, it is its admirers, its fans, its devotees, it is our inability to state precisely why and eloquently why it moves us. This is crucial going forward. Now, each of these difficulties I have outlined show us just how hard it is to determine or point to something and call it a classic. It shows how difficult the difficulties that go into that word itself and how long and under what conditions a book will hold on to it. Now, if all of this sounds a bit maddening, I'll tell you why it sounds a bit maddening. Because it describes very much the relationship we have with people. They grow and they change. Our relationship grows and changes depending on where we are in our own lives. Our friendships ebb and flow as all relationships do. The difference, though, is that not one word of Middlemarch has changed since it was published 150 years ago. That is the one way that Middlemarch is different than an old friend. Nothing is different about Middlemarch. Middlemarch, therefore, is not another person in that relationship, but it is a lens. We have changed infinitely, and we can see that through our repeated visits with a great book. The wonder and invitation of a great book is to see ourselves and our world through it. 3 quick examples of that, if you would. Does everybody know Henry V by Shakespeare? Henry V is historically referred to as Shakespeare's most English play. I don't quite know why, because who is more English than Shakespeare? But Henry V is essentially a true story. It is a true story about an English king who, in the 15th century, kept the French from invading England and kept England safe from outside invaders. The story of Henry V was 150 years old when William Shakespeare wrote it. It would be the equivalent of someone today writing about the Civil War. The events were long gone, the people in it long dead. But what was happening in England when Shakespeare wrote it? Well, England had a queen, Queen Elizabeth, first. And as you all know, that queen had no children, no siblings, no heirs. What happens in 16th century England and in Europe when you have a monarch that has no heirs? That's like waving the flag to everybody else in Europe that says, the borders are unguarded, please invade. It is bad news when you don't have an heir. It means that the country is vulnerable. And Queen Elizabeth was getting older and sicker. She had been the queen a very long time, and England was terrified that the queen dies, and France and Spain and Germany and anyone else who can rub 2 troops together pours in. And the end of England as we know it. What does William Shakespeare do? William Shakespeare writes a play about what? The glory of England. The glory of the king that defended England from outside invaders, that kept England safe, that assured that our country, our culture, our way of life would continue. It was a great play. But it was a very, very calculated piece of political propaganda. It was designed to make everybody who was going to the theater after work that day or that evening feel okay about the very scary set of circumstances that were befalling England at that time. Now, let's flash forward all the way to 1944, when a man named Laurence Olivier decided to make a film version of Henry V. In part paid for by the British government. Lucky him, right? Why? Because what is going on in England in 1944? World War II. London has been flattened. London is in ruins. Europe is in terror. America has entered the war at this point, but England is in very bad shape. What does Laurence Olivier, combined with the British government, do? Makes a movie about a time when England survived and triumphed. When England looked its foreign invaders in the eye and won. The speech, "Once more into the breach, my friends, once more," that we all know from Henry V, was at that time, when Laurence Olivier delivered it, considered a call to every able-bodied person in England at that time. A great play, a great movie, a very calculated piece of political propaganda 400 years later. Let's flash forward 50 years. 1989, a young graduate of the Royal Shakespeare Company named Kenneth Branagh makes his first movie. What does he make? Henry V. It is considered one of the great adaptations of Shakespeare in film history. Henry V ends with a flirtation between Kenneth Branagh and the French Queen after England has triumphed over the invading French forces. It was Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson who were married at the time, but that's just subtext. What occurs directly before that? What is the very last shot of England triumphing over its foreign invaders? It is the king, Henry V, played by Kenneth Branagh, who picks one of his fallen troops up over his shoulder and drags him through the battlefield. And everywhere is the stench and the smell of death and of blood and of suffering. This is Scarlett O'Hara walking across the field of dead bodies. Does this sound like a movie about the triumph and glory of Mother England? Maybe. But you know what this movie is saying? This movie is saying that triumph comes at a terrible, terrible cost. The cost of blood and lives of your countrymen and women and suffering. What is going on in 1989? We are at the end of the Cold War. We are at the end of the Age of Empires. What is this Henry V saying? This Henry V is saying empire is a thing that is very scary and is built on blood and in suffering. This is not a movie about the glory of empire. This is an interpretation of Shakespeare about the cost of empire. 3 versions of Henry V. Not one word is different from Shakespeare's text in any of those. 3 radically different pieces of art created from it. How about an example a little closer to home? How about To Kill a Mockingbird? To Kill a Mockingbird is about a great number of things. It is about racism. It is about growing up. It is about the American South and the Great Depression. It is about the criminal justice system, how it works and how it doesn't work. It is a very American novel. It is about this country in a very real degree. I want to ask you all a question about To Kill a Mockingbird, though. How old was Scout Finch in this book? 8, 9, 12, 14. What if I told you it was a trick question? The trick question is, how old is the Scout Finch in this book or the Scout Finch narrating this book? To Kill a Mockingbird is told in flashback. And as such, I think one can safely assume, because this book was pretty autobiographical, that the Scout Finch telling us the story of To Kill a Mockingbird is probably about the age that Harper Lee was when she wrote this book, which was 30. Harper Lee, when she wrote this book, had moved to New York City from a small town in Alabama, like the one in To Kill a Mockingbird, to become a writer. She wrote this book in the dead of winter while working as a reservation agent for Eastern Airlines during the day. She wrote it on the typewriter her father gave to her when she was 9 years old. And he believed in her literary talent. She was far from home. It was the first time she had left Alabama. She was trying to put together the greatest creative project of her life. She was alone, she was scared, and she was writing this book on the typewriter that the first person who believed in her talent as a writer gave to her. Is it possible then that To Kill a Mockingbird is very much a letter of thank you from a daughter to a father? Why do I say this? The first 100 pages of To Kill a Mockingbird, Tom Robinson never shows up. I was convinced when I reread this book that the trial begins on like page 10. No, the first 100 pages are just about Atticus as someone's dad. Atticus raising a young boy and a young girl as a widower. This book is as much a tribute to fatherhood and the relationship between fathers and daughters as it is to all of the other things I just named, which is why I think it makes a wonderful Father's Day gift. Remember this come next June. Final example, The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, published in 1925. That book gave birth to the thing called the Jazz Age. The person who wrote it and his wife were the kings and queens of the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age was embodied by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald. And all of the things we think are so sexy about the Jazz Age, fast cars and beautiful clothes and a raised martini glass, and in the case of A Great Gatsby, a love that cannot be. Tell me how intoxicating that was to read in high school. The Great Gatsby is another book told in flashback, meaning that everything that happens in The Great Gatsby is over when it's being told. The Great Gatsby then gives birth to an era while talking about its ending at the same time. How's that for a trick? And that immortal last passage that we all remember, and so we beat on, boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past, is about what? Is about the acceptance of what we have lost and cannot get back. It is a concept you simply do not understand as a teenager when you read that book, when you feel like time is going to stretch on forever. It is in fact a kind, even though F. Scott Fitzgerald was only 28 years old when he wrote this book, it is a kind of pan to maturity. It is a way that it is The Great Gatsby saying part of us growing up and growing older is the acceptance of what we cannot get back. It's about the loss. It's about loss of a lot of things. 3 books, 3 radically different ways of looking at them, depending on where you are in life when you do the looking. I feel incredibly fortunate to get to do these things with the great works of literature, of our time, of all time. I feel like I made 50 new friends in the process. But also in this process, I grew to accept what great books, I grew to understand what great books can do and to accept also what they cannot do. Let's start with the cannots, because it's always better to get the depressing stuff out of the way first. A great book will not make you a better person. I'm sorry. I am sure that there are deeply romantic cases of where a lost soul in junior high school read Anna Karenina and it changed them forever. Those are miracle cases, and that is why we talk about them. We would do best not to hinge our teaching of great literature to miracles, but instead what they say about the ordinary lives of their generations of readers, including the generation we have now. What else will great books not do? They will not instill a love of reading in a person if that person is plain not interested. I'm sorry. And that's okay. Not everybody loves books. I know that's like sacrilege to say in here. But you know what? Not everybody loves tomatoes, too. Also sacrilege to say in Northern California. I don't happen to like tomatoes. We may consider that a tragic missed opportunity here in Northern California. It is not a sin, but a preference. And that's okay. Number 3, a great book will not survive on simple compliments and mandates. I know a great many of us in this room, including myself, are worried that these books seem to have no place in the modern educational system or even in the lives of us here in the second decade of the 21st century. I promise you, my friends, the answer to that seeming problem is not to take these books more seriously. I am asked all of the time, Kevin, how can we get kids or schools or society or my next door neighbor or my brother-in-law to take these books more seriously? And I say, stop using the words more seriously. We need people to take these books far less seriously. We will not get anywhere with the future readers of classics by telling them that their existing life priorities are wrong. Instead, we have to be willing to meet them at least halfway. We have to make these books relevant. We have to make them fun. We feel that way about them, don't we? We are all here because reading and books is one of the great joys of our lives. It makes absolutely no sense for us to feel that way about books and insist that anybody who hasn't gotten here yet treat them like broccoli instead of chocolate. It's not fair and it's wrong. And finally, a great book cannot and should not support our fears. The history of the reading is in trouble because, fill in the blank, is long and not particularly dignified. The great English intellectual John Stuart Mill was convinced that newspapers would be the death of books. Why? Because if you can get everything you need, throw it on your doorstep first thing in the morning, and you can read it in 15 minutes over breakfast, why do you ever need a longer book on the subject? He was convinced that that would be the end. In the early 20th century, many people were convinced that the automobile would be the death of books. Can't read and drive. If you're tooling around all the time, you're not going to have any time for reading. And the same has been said about radio, television, the internet, video games, cell phones, zoos, you name it. It has been said about all of these things, and history has never, ever borne it out. It has never happened. Yet we persist in this delusion that this thing that civilization has enjoyed for thousands of years is somehow always in peril. It is not in peril. Great books, these things called the classics, should make us eager to see what the world has to offer us, to make us embrace possibility, to move forward. They are called classics because despite what time throws at them, they remain. They continue to be relevant. The message of a classic, then, is of forward progress. Not of hiding in the past, not of fearing the future. Forward progress. And on that note, let's talk about the more optimistic part of this, what classics can do. They can bring great variety to your reading life. Books, in my humble opinion, are there to challenge us, not always give us a hug. So every 10th book should be one where you'd say, well, I would never read about this person or this subject or this book at this length. Go for it. The simple designation of something being a classic can send you down a reading path you would not ordinarily go, to worlds you would not ordinarily visit, and the richness in that is immeasurable. 2, a great book can encourage you to slow down. No matter how hard we try, no matter how much we pack our days, we are not going to be able to outrun Shakespeare, or Jane Austen, or George Eliot, or Emily Dickinson. They and their work will be around long after we are all gone. Which means, as I see it, it will always be here for us. It is just waiting for us anytime we want. And I think that's fabulous. The message I take from that is the universe is telling me that as a reader, I have way more time than I think. None of this is going to expire like an open bottle of milk on my nightstand. It will all be here for whenever I can get to it. And finally, given that we can see all the lives we have led each and every time we revisit a book is the greatest blessing of them all. Doing this can encourage each of us to place ourselves in perspective, to see our lives as part of a larger whole, as part of the great sweep of history, to see ourselves as someone with many stories, as someone who has made mistakes, who has both failed and triumphed, as someone who has survived, and as someone who is here. A great book is a witness to our fundamental humanity. These things together, diversity, thoughtfulness, introspection, wisdom, this, my friends, this is the stuff of a well-lived life. This was the first book that I had written all by myself. In 2005, I edited an anthology, which I kind of see as the lead-up to this project. Practical Classics has done fine. I am very pleased with it. But the greatest gift of all of coming from it is the lifelong friends I have made. Not just other readers like yourselves, but people like Jane Austen and Carson McCullers and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Chinua Achebe and Emily Dickinson. I will be writing about a lot of other things in my career, God willing. A lot of other things that interest me too. These new friends will always be here. And what a nice community of friends it is to belong to. It doesn't cost anything to join. It isn't open only one day a week. Everybody is invited. Like this place we're sitting in right now. It's here. And it is here for all of us. This, my friends, is the great conversation our species was promised when we developed the ability to think and to share and to hope and to pass on to the next generation what we have learned. This is the great conversation. I welcome you to it because I've been expecting you. Thank you. All right. Oh, we're gonna. Do we have time to do some trivia? Okay. All right. I just want to make sure we're not. All right. So we don't have a buzzer or anything, so I think we're just gonna have to kind of go on the honor system. Raise your hand if you think you know the answers to these. Remember that old truism from the board game Trivial Pursuit. The answer is often in the question. So listen carefully. You don't have to do Jeopardy. You don't have to answer in the form of a question or anything like that. Should we start with an easy one, or should we just jump right in? So this side of the room wants the hard one. This side of the room wants the easy one. All right. We're going to do the hard one first, okay? All right. In 1962, this American novelist was awarded the Nobel Prize. When asked if he deserved it, he replied, frankly, no. Who is he? Sir? John Steinbeck. That is correct. The answer is John Steinbeck. Be sure this man in the green shirt gets a free book when the time comes. The books are available over to the left of the bar.
You got the answer from the woman next to him.
Make sure the man in the green shirt has to buy 2 books. The funny thing about when I ask that question is inevitably someone almost always answers Ernest Hemingway, and you can only win the Nobel Prize if you're alive. And I have to explain at that point that Ernest Hemingway blew his brains out the year before, which is always a little uncomfortable. Okay. All right. Back to our friend Jane Austen for a moment. Which 2 Jane Austen books were published after she died? You don't have to get both of them. Now, there were only 6. So Sir? Northanger Abbey is correct. But let's applaud that gentleman. If you can get the other one, we'll count that as a free book too. Ma'am, right here. Persuasion is correct also. This is a smart group. All right, the man with the gray beard right here and the woman in the black with the pretty necklace, they each get a free book also. All right. One more? All right. In what sort of building, comma, obviously, uncomma, did Ray Bradbury write Fahrenheit 451? In the back.
Firehouse?
Close, not a firehouse. Ma'am in the white shirt on the aisle, did you have an answer? No, I guess not. Sir? It is not in a prison. But that would have been, I almost like that story better than the actual one. Back there. A library. The story is that Ray Bradbury. Right. You said that first. Both of you can have books. The story is actually pretty funny. Ray Bradbury had. What? I did. It's, you get a free book too. The story is that Ray Bradbury at the time had young children, and he had an office in his garage, and he trying to write, and his kids kept bothering him. So he decided to head to the UCLA Public Library because it was the only place he thought he could hide out, and at the time you could rent a typewriter by the hour at the UCLA Public Library. And so he would rent a typewriter by the hour and type frantically, and once he was out of quarters he perused the shelf and tried to get inspired, and that is the reason that Fahrenheit 451 was written there. I think we should do some Q&A. Sir?
You said reading a classic won't make you a better
Can you just wait?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You said reading the classics won't make you a better person, but then you listed a number of things which to me, a psychiatrist, thinks of as growth in people. Finding perspective, being able to fit your life into a continuum, to identify with larger themes in the whole human enterprise. How do you square that?
No, you are quite right. You are quite right. I was perhaps a bit glib when I said a classic will not make you a better person. I think the approach that we sometimes have to great books, which is that they are designed to save lost souls, is perhaps overstating it a bit. I think as readers we have to be willing to let the influences of great books in, which does take some resiliency and some vulnerability with the story and the narrative and the way it moves us. But no, I think perhaps I was a bit glib in saying that a classic will not categorically ever make you a better person, because I feel like it has for me. Sir, on the aisle.
How do you feel about people who use the term instant classic to describe their books before they're even published?
To describe their books or someone else's books?
Well, people who market books before they're even published as instant classics.
I don't know. I mean, like.
Disney's been doing it for years with their films, but I see publishers starting to do it now with books.
They have, and it's funny because I'm an enormous movie buff, and there's a phenomenon that people talk about in movies right now, which is called like a Scarlet Fever box office hit, which is a movie that does enormously well and makes a huge pile of money, and then is forgotten. You sort of recover from it, and it's like it never happened. I mean, I just read the other day that Avatar is going to have 3 sequels. I don't remember the first Avatar, and it was 5 years ago, and it is the most successful movie of all time, which I think is crazy, because I think it points to what you're talking about this idea of an instant classic. It's a word we sort of throw behind something when we feel like a great wave of marketing and potential success is about to carry it somewhere fabulous. As this Avatar example shows, making a pile of money assures no place in the future memory of people. I think it is instant classic, maybe like giant shrimp. You know, one of those words. One of those words that just contains a contradiction at its core. Sir?
Do you have any non-fiction books on the list?
I do. Now, forgive me, there's 50 in here, and I have to go back to them often. But the autobiography of Malcolm X is in here. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried is in here, which I think is one of the great novels about war. And The Band Played On is in here, which is not only a nonfiction classic, but particularly important to those of us here in the Bay Area. Yes, there are some others in here. I'm not remembering specifically what they are. Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan is in here. So I'd say there's probably a half dozen nonfiction books. As someone who writes nonfiction, I'm extremely partial to nonfiction books. Sadly, they are not taught to the degree they should be in high school English classes. Sir.
I'm a very busy person. Is there a ranking system that says, read these 5, these are the best of the best? Is there any way, is this sorted out in any way?
Yes. So there is an essay in this book, which I won't make you read because you're a very busy person. There is an essay in this book about Toni Morrison's Sula, which I picked specifically because I love Toni Morrison, but Toni Morrison is slow going. Toni Morrison stuff is very dense and very thick, and I find you got to wade kind of slowly through it. So I picked Sula as a way to sort of tiptoe into the ocean that is Toni Morrison, because it is her shortest and most accessible book. And in that essay, I advocate that there are 2 ways to read classics: the cannonball approach and the dog paddle approach. Cannonball approach means look at an author's body of work, take the biggest, most famous one of it, and grab that. Just dive in with both feet and both hands. The dog paddle approach is take a look at an author's body of work and pick the easiest one, the shortest one, and begin with that. I am a dog paddle person. I believe that if you want to expose yourself to Charles Dickens, who wrote a good number of books, start with something small and fast and consumable. In terms of which authors you should go to first, that largely depends on your interests. But believe me, as I say repeatedly in Practical Classics, you have my full permission to begin with the shortest, easiest books you can. I think the act of finishing is sometimes as empowering as the act of reading, because finishing means you get to sort of assess where you are, look at your position, and say, where do I go from here? Which to me is one of the great joys of the journey of reading. So read short is what I would suggest. Ma'am, in the back.
So I was hoping to hear a little bit more about some of the books on your list, and I like the way that last man thinks. So along perhaps similar lines, could you share some surprises that landed on your list that you didn't expect to?
Yes.
Expect that they would be there.
Yes. So a word of housekeeping. The book is organized into 10 sections, each of which corresponds to kind of an archetypal phase of life. So the first section is about growing up. The second section is about identity formation. There are sections on family, on parents and children, on growing older, on the future, on work, on all of those sorts of things. Just a few examples of books that I was a little bit surprised that I came to and I loved as much as I did. I had no idea I was an Edith Wharton fan in Waiting. I mean, I am a Midwestern upper middle class Jew. That's not what Edith Wharton does. But I find her stuff, even though it's about 19th century New York waspy aristocrats, I find her stuff incredibly moving. And I talk about The Age of Innocence in here, which I just find a stunningly beautiful book. I found myself really into Heinrich Ibsen. Which I guess anybody who takes high school or college drama would read. Heinrich Ibsen is considered the greatest playwright since Shakespeare, and I read The Dollhouse for this particular book, and I said, wow! I mean, The Dollhouse is in 1873 is radically ahead of its time in terms of marriage and gender relations and what it has to say about family and why we choose to be with the people we choose to be with. It's an incredible study of the dynamics of marriage. I was a little bit surprised that I would be as into that as I was. I also read Sherlock Holmes's Hound of the Baskervilles, which ended up in this book, because I had never read Sherlock Holmes and I wanted to solve a nagging question, and I didn't want to go to Wikipedia or something like that. I wanted to know, Dr. Watson was a doctor of what? That's what I wanted to know. So I picked up I dog paddled, I picked up the shortest, fastest, most popular Sherlock Holmes book I could think of, Hound of the Baskervilles, and I realized that in Hound of the Baskervilles, Dr. Watson practices medicine on exactly 0 pages. Does not write a prescription, does not see a patient. And Sherlock Holmes, from the moment he wakes up to the moment he falls asleep, is a detective. There is no Sherlock Holmes without his detective-ness. And so I said, Sherlock Holmes, probably also because Arthur Conan Doyle was a person who really had literary aspirations elsewhere and considered Sherlock Holmes his day job. Sherlock Holmes is a book, in many ways, about work. It is a book about people who work at some jobs because they consider it part of their identity, and people who do work that is of one kind, but their passions are really lie in their avocations, like John Watson. I had no idea. I had no idea that this was the case. And of course I watched the Sherlock Holmes Game of Shadows movie to prep, and the first 45 minutes has Jude Law as Dr. Watson practicing medicine like every single time. And I think that was just because they weren't going to get a movie star like Jude Law and be like, your job is to follow Sherlock Holmes around. So that was a surprise too. Ma'am, sitting against the pole. Exactly. This is a great question. I think particularly being here in America, it gives us an amazing opportunity, because the story of this country, as we all know, is the battle over who really gets to claim themselves as American and who doesn't. And the reason that battle is so sort of fatalistic and silly is because this thing called America is actually made up of all of us, isn't it? This thing we call American. If you ever look at a cartoon when some person from another country visits America, and the very first thing they do is have a slice of pizza and wear a cowboy hat and play baseball. Well, baseball comes from England, and cowboys come from Argentina, and pizza comes from Italy. I mean, that's America. America is all of these different influences. I'm a huge music person, and if you look at this thing called American music, which is far and away the most diverse music on earth, think of the musical forms that were invented right here in America. Country, soul, R&B, rock and roll, hip-hop, bluegrass, jazz. All invented right here. Why? Because America is this stew pot of all of these different kinds of people. And I think if we untangle that definition, if we teach an American literature class and say you cannot teach an American literature class that does not include books by these groups that you are speaking of, well, then you're really not teaching about American literature, are you? Because we are represented by our diversity. And by the way, now in 2013, the same is true for pretty much every country on earth. I'm sorry, you cannot teach contemporary British literature without teaching Zadie Smith and Kazuo Ishiguro. Kazuo Ishiguro is more British than people. His books are more British than than a lot of authors born and raised in England, and he's Japanese. So this is a very long answer to your question, but I feel like if we are truly honest with what a national identity is, then diversity comes part and parcel with that. And ma'am.
My question is about youth. Do you have any plans, perhaps, to write something for younger people and introducing them in a way to the classics?
I would love to. I would love to. My publisher took a bit of a flyer with this book. My publisher is traditionally a bit more academic than I am, and I have proposed such a thing, and they have not been interested. I would love to write that book. I would love to come back to that book at some point. There's other things that I really want to get to first. But yes, I think the way that I will address that need, because you're not the first person who said that, is I hope to spend some time with students. I hope to spend some time in public speaking and in teaching in schools. Not only this year, but as the opportunity presents itself in the future. I've done it a little bit, and I've just enjoyed the heck out of it. And the fact is, I can do public speaking in schools and spend time with students a lot faster and at a lot more frequent clip than I can in the 10 months to a year that it would take to write a book. So I think instead of writing another book, I will probably address that need through public speaking. Thanks. Over here, and then the gentleman in the red shirt. Yes, sir, you. Mm-hmm.
Stephen King, while rolling in money, has complained that he doesn't get enough critical reception or regard. Do you have any place for genre writers in your list?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and not just someone like Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle. Fahrenheit 451 is on this list. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is on this list. If a book is a mystery or a romance or a crime, there are classics in all of those areas. And I've made some room for them on my particular list, but I think the arbitrary fences we build around categories are silly and wrong. I do not think a classic needs to come in one particular literary form in order to be called a classic. Just as a song doesn't have to be a symphony or a 9-minute jazz solo to be a classic. It can be Rock Around the Clock, Happy Birthday. Sir, in the red shirt. No, I don't.
Secondly, I was fortunate enough to go to a Great Books College where we did nothing but read classics.
Oh, wow.
For 4 years. I recommend that everybody here do that immediately. And if you're too busy, send your kids to a Great Books College. They can spend 4 years reading these books and many, many more. There's only 2 of them in the country. They're small and they're good.
Well, there's an endorsement for St. John's.
St. John's and Shimer College.
Sir.
Shimer College in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What is your academic background and what was your field of study?
Creative writing, graduated 1995 from Johns Hopkins. I got there the year after John Barth retired, shucks. I went into journalism from there. I was mostly a nonfiction student, even though I was in the creative writing department. And then I did graduate work at UT Austin in the American Studies program, where I specialized mostly in 1930s and 40s popular culture, and I wrote my thesis on Depression-era crime photography. Crime photography. I looked at a lot of pictures of murders. Ma'am, in the back. Tons. Yes, many. We have some of them here in the Bay Area. We have Michael Chabon and Amy Tan and Isabel Allende and Dave Eggers. I think Michael Cunningham is certainly creating classics. I think Margaret Atwood already has. I think Margaret Atwood could die tomorrow and would be considered one of these authors. I think Alice Munro, same thing. Joyce Carol Oates, same thing. Oh yeah, I mean pick up an issue of the Paris Review of the last 10 years and look at who the interviews were by. All of those people are going to write books that we will call classics, or if they haven't already. Yeah?
You mentioned earlier Harold Bloom.
Uh-huh.
About 50 years ago, he was my professor in Western Canada.
Oh, no kidding.
which he finally filed here.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, this is about the skill of resentment and his position on the canon,
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare being the foundation.
Absolutely.
Dante, Joyce, and so forth. What is your take on him as a critic's critic, really?
Sure.
And on this book, which is a classic in itself?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I should say that I come from a biased point of view because my youngest brother went to Yale, was in Timothy Dwight College where Harold Bloom was the house professor, and my brother used to see Harold Bloom at the gym. And so he used to talk about how Harold Bloom worked out with this trainer and would and hated being on the treadmill, and would say to his trainer, whose name was Eli, he would say, "Eli, I have some thoughts on I am working on some thoughts about Emily Dickinson," while he was on the trainer, and Eli would say, "That's nice, Harold, keep walking." I admire the heck out of the dedication that Harold Bloom has paid to the world of literature, has spent his career edifying. Harold Bloom, who was born into incredibly modest circumstances, a son of an immigrant in this country, and really, as many men of his generation, saw a knowledge of the great books as his path out of poverty and to a kind of not only economic but spiritual and intellectual enlightenment. And I stand on the shoulders of men and women like that, because he is of my grandfather's generation, and my grandparents came to this country and believed the same thing. Where Harold Bloom and I part company is his attitude that the Western canon is some sort of humorless cross to bear, that it's something that we all have to kind of slog through painfully because it's good for us. I simply don't have that approach to great books as a reader, and I think it is an ineffective sales tool to get people to read great books. To me, reading a great book is an act of hedonistic joy, as anybody who has stayed up all night reading knows. And to view it as the intellectual equivalent of going to the dentist, I think is doing the Western canon, which I hardly dismiss out of hand. I don't sit there and say, oh, it's a bunch of dead white guys, so therefore it's not relevant to me. I think those are great books, and they're great books for a reason. But I think the approach that we all have to painfully grit our teeth through them is wrong. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, or do we adjourn to? Which do we? Are we asking, or are we adjourning? One more question. Oh, can we make it two? All right. Ma'am, in the white coat and then the white shirt.
So often authors are asked what their favorite book is, and it's certainly hard, I'm sure, for you to get it down to one, but are there a couple that you just say that they just love them, they've always resonated with you?
I don't really have favorites, but And the Band Played On is the most important book to me. It's the reason it's in here. Essay 24, I think. Yeah.
Sort of the opposite to that question. Are there books that are considered classics by those people that are elite, that tell us they're classics, that you personally believe do not deserve to be classics?
Yes. The chapter in this book about the Scarlet Letter is called The Scarlet Letter, I Didn't Like It Either. And I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. And it's not that I'm bearing a grudge against Nathaniel Hawthorne. I like a number of his books. I find The Scarlet Letter like trying to take off a wet raincoat. I just find it long and humorless and waterlogged. Even though it's only 160 pages, it feels incredibly long and humorless and waterlogged and lacking any real humanity. And maybe I'm missing something because people love that book, but The Scarlet Letter and I were not meant to be friends, and that's okay. You can't be friends with everybody. I don't dispute that why people consider it a classic, and I have it in here because as a kind of stand-in for the act of difficult reading. We all need to read things that don't immediately run up to us and embrace us, because that's part of the joy and the challenge of being a reader. But one of every 10 books or so should be that. And the other 9, yeah. What?
Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
I hated reading the Scarlet Letter, and I'm so glad I did. It prepared me for the real world, for American women in the 60s.
I can see that. It totally makes sense to me. Ma'am, I'm going to take your question, and then we're going to go sign books.
You said that the words never change.
Mm-hmm.
Classics. How do you think about work that's translated into other languages?
That adds an entirely different dimension to this, which I wish I had more time to address in this particular book. But yes, absolutely. Like I have an essay about Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart in this book, who is an author who wrote a beautiful book in English, but English was not his first language. English was Joseph Conrad's like 4th language or something. And so a book has a enormous journey between the language it was originally written in and the one we may read it in, which is different. And all sorts of things can happen in that journey. You're absolutely right that complicates the question of at what point do we sort of declare a classic finished, and at what point is it still in transition to becoming itself. Folks, this has been enormous fun. Thank you so much for being here.